Join me as we take a deeper look into a story that has stirred intense emotion, divided opinions, and sparked some of the most uncomfortable conversations the gospel community has faced in recent years. This is not just a story about one church, one marriage, or one moment caught in the public eye. It is a story about leadership, accountability, silence, faith, and the cost of carrying influence in spaces built on trust. Deitrick Haddon is a name recognized far beyond church walls. Known globally as a gospel singer, songwriter, and pastor, he has spent decades shaping modern gospel music while leading the Cathedral of Faith in Detroit, Michigan. For many, his music has been a source of hope, healing, and inspiration. His church has long been viewed as a pillar in its community, offering spiritual guidance, outreach, and consistency in a changing world. For years, the image surrounding Deitrick Haddon and his ministry appeared solid. The message was clear, the platform strong, and the influence undeniable. But as history has shown time and time again, moments of crisis often arrive without warning, and when they do, they rarely stay contained. That moment came when a public statement made by his wife, Marcia Haddon, sent shockwaves through the church community and beyond. Her words were unexpected. They were not loud, dramatic, or filled with accusation, yet the weight behind them was unmistakable. Almost instantly, questions began circulating. Interpretations varied, reactions intensified, and the silence that followed only deepened the tension. What made this situation so impactful was not just what was said, but what was implied, and perhaps more importantly, what was left unsaid. People were left to interpret meaning on their own, and as often happens in moments like this, the public filled in the gaps with assumptions, emotion, and personal experience. Within days, the conversation expanded far beyond one church. It spread across social media platforms, group chats, podcasts, and pulpits. Supporters expressed confusion and concern. Critics voiced disappointment and frustration. Neutral observers watched closely, recognizing that something larger than a personal conflict was unfolding in real time. The church found itself in a precarious position. Reputation, trust, and credibility were suddenly being questioned. For a faith community built on unity and shared belief, the division was impossible to ignore. Some members felt betrayed, others felt protective. Many simply felt unsure of what to believe. As the story continued to circulate, something interesting began to happen. Old wounds across faith communities started resurfacing. People began sharing stories of leaders they once admired but later questioned. Some admitted they had noticed warning signs long before but chose silence out of respect, fear, or loyalty. Others said they believed speaking up would only bring judgment or damage the church they loved. This is where the narrative shifted. What initially appeared to be a personal matter involving a pastor and his wife began reflecting a much larger issue within religious spaces. The focus moved away from a single incident and toward long-standing questions about power, protection, and accountability. Many began asking whether churches had unintentionally created environments where image was prioritized over honesty, where leaders were expected to be flawless, where vulnerability was seen as weakness rather than humanity. In such spaces, silence often becomes the default response, even when pain exists beneath the surface. The controversy forced uncomfortable conversations into the open. Should leaders always be corrected privately, regardless of the scope of their influence? Or does public leadership demand public responsibility? Is grace meant to restore, or has it sometimes been used as a shield against consequences? There were no easy answers, and that uncertainty kept the discussion alive. What surprised many was how deeply divided people became. Music that once unified listeners now sat at the center of debate. Some could no longer listen without thinking about the controversy. Others refused to allow one moment to overshadow years of impact and ministry. Online prayers appeared alongside harsh criticism. Support and anger existed side by side. The emotional contrast was striking. On one side were those calling for transparency, accountability, and clear communication. On the other were those urging patience, grace, and respect for privacy. Both sides believed they were right. Neither side seemed willing to fully listen to the other. As time passed, the silence from Deitrick Haddon himself became a focal point. For some it signaled restraint and wisdom. For others it felt heavy with unanswered questions. Silence, in moments like these, carries its own message, even when no words are spoken. And yet, something else was happening beneath the surface. The gospel community itself began to change. Churches started discussing topics they once avoided. Conversations about emotional health, accountability structures, counseling, and leadership support became more visible. Some pastors admitted they feared reaching out for help because they believed strength meant carrying burdens alone. Others acknowledged that they had never been taught how to lead while also being human. This is how one painful moment exposed cracks that had existed for years. The focus slowly shifted from blame to responsibility. Not just individual responsibility, but communal responsibility. People began asking whether faith communities had built systems that protected platforms more than people. whether loyalty had sometimes silenced truth, whether grace had been misunderstood or misused. What made this story different was that it did not end with a clear apology, a detailed explanation, or a defined resolution. There was no dramatic closing statement to wrap everything up neatly. Instead, it ended with uncertainty. Some believed restoration was still possible. Others believed damage had already been done. Families, friendships, and trust had all been affected. Healing did not move at the speed of social media, and many were forced to sit with unresolved feelings. Perhaps the most difficult realization was that two truths could exist at the same time. A leader could change lives through music and ministry while still facing serious personal challenges. A community could believe deeply in grace and still demand accountability. These truths did not cancel each other out, but holding them together required maturity and honesty. As the public conversation slowly evolved, the tone began to shift. Anger softened for some, while confusion deepened for others. People who once felt certain began questioning their own assumptions. The same event that triggered instant judgment now invited reflection. Many started looking beyond headlines and viral clips. They asked deeper questions. What happens to leaders after the cameras turn away? What happens to families whose pain becomes public property? What happens when faith, identity, and influence collide under public scrutiny? This story became less about taking sides and more about examining systems. It challenged the gospel world to look inward and ask what truly mattered. Power or honesty? Silence or truth? Image or healing? The answers were not clear, but the questions could no longer be ignored. To understand the weight of Marsha Haddon's statement, it is important to consider the public response it triggered. Followers expressed shock, disappointment, concern, and support, often all at once. Some defended her courage, others questioned timing and intent. The emotional response was layered and complex. Critics called for Deitrick Haddon to address the situation directly. Some accused church leadership of mishandling the moment. Others argued that public pressure only complicated an already painful situation. Social media amplified every opinion, turning personal reflection into public debate. The situation escalated quickly. Loyal supporters rallied around the Haddons, emphasizing past impact and calling for grace. Detractors viewed the controversy as evidence of deeper issues within church leadership culture. Both perspectives gained traction, fueling ongoing discussion. In the end, what began as a personal statement evolved into a mirror held up to the entire gospel community. It revealed how deeply people care about integrity, leadership, and faith. It exposed pain that had long been hidden beneath polished platforms. And it reminded everyone watching that behind every microphone, every sermon, and every song is a human life, often more fragile than it appears. This story is far from over. The most difficult questions remain unanswered. The final outcome is still uncertain. But one thing is clear: the conversation it sparked has already left a lasting impact. Not just on one church, not just on one leader, but on everyone who listened, questioned, and reflected on what faith looks like when tested. And maybe that is the most powerful part of this story. It did not provide closure. It demanded growth. Thank you for watching. If you have thoughts on this situation, feel free to share them in the comments. And if you're interested in more thoughtful conversations around church culture, leadership, and accountability, be sure to check out my other videos and subscribe for more.